45 minutes or so, I would like to talk about graphic design. And I've divided this presentation into 4 smaller bits. First, I would like to talk about graphic design practice, the visual communication practice. What do graphic designers actually do? And what are their activities? In the second part, I would like to evaluate the quality of graphic design. How do we know if graphic design is any good? And what are the relevant criteria to decide if design is any good? In the third part, I would look at arguments that designers can use to convince other people. There's no point in having absolutely brilliant design at your own computer if nobody else looks at it. You must make sure that other people, non-designers, can use your materials. So basically, I present in each of these 3 sections the background of the graphic design profession. In the first part, I look at what designers actually do. In the second part, I'll talk about the criteria. And in the third part, I'll look about the ways that we convince other people that our designs are absolutely fantastic. And at the end, I'll draw some conclusions. But first, I would like to focus on what graphic design actually is. In 2006, about 12 years ago now, I was appointed as a professor in graphic design in the Netherlands in Breda. I signed a contract that stated that I should do some teaching and that I should do some research in this area. But one of my first questions to the staff and the management of that university was, what do you mean by graphic design? And absolute silence was the result. They did not know what graphic design was. There was no common agreement what the graphic design was. There was no staff central core of activities. There was no curriculum development. Exactly the same problems as we have seen in Lutzer yesterday. So my question was, is there a common core in graphic design? Is there something that all graphic designers agree on that is part of their profession? And what is this common core? And where are the borders? So where does graphic design stop and go into other areas? What are the activities that graphic designers do not do? And nobody could give me answers, and that means that if you are involved in curriculum development, you don't know what the next project is going to be. You don't know what the next topic that you have to teach is going to be. Is programming part of graphic design? Well, if you don't define graphic design, you don't know. You cannot make a decision about that. So the first half a year I spent asking students and staff and management what they actually meant by graphic design and visual communication and how they actually teach these things. And it turned out it was very vague and opaque and not very useful. So I wrote a research proposal to start answering this question. What is graphic design and what are their borders? And these are the groups of people that could actually give answers to what graphic design is. Of course, you can ask graphic designers themselves, but you could also ask clients, because they pay for graphic design. You can ask universities and polytechnics and institutes and design schools, what do you teach? You can ask museums and archives, what do you collect and what do you show as graphic design? You can ask the professional associations, you can ask researchers, you can ask the graphic design contests and awards and annual reviews. And you could read publications about graphic design. And all of these groups give very different answers. So if you ask a museum what graphic design is, it gives a different answer than what the professional practice actually does. So I just chose what graphic designers do, and I approached graphic designers, because I think the professionals actually can tell me what they're doing. And the research was done in a small city in the Netherlands, in the south, in Breda. And Breda is a medieval city. It's based on Roman ruins, and then medieval, it's around 1200 it started growing. It's got a cathedral, it's got a university, it's got an art school, it's got several museums. And we started by making a list of graphic designers in that particular city. Very simple, yellow pages, the phone book, the city council, the Chamber of Commerce, registration, the VAT office, to find out who are graphic designers in this particular city. And within 2 weeks, we found about 100 agencies. 100 agencies stated graphic design on their front door, stating, we are graphic designers. And they're all registered with the tax service and they're registered with the Chamber of Commerce. These are not small schoolboys who live in the loft on their parents' house with a stolen Macintosh and some illegal software. These are registered companies. And this is where they are based. So we made a map of Breda. Breda is this medieval center. And so it's not necessary to work in the center. Most graphic designers actually work outside the center. All of these designers work outside the capital of the Netherlands. And these are the first 100 companies, and after a few weeks after that, we got in contact with 170 graphic design companies, 170. And we found 200 graphic designers working in printing offices, advertising agencies, design agencies, as part of a larger group. So within probably about 3 months, we found 710 graphic designers in a city of 140,000 people. We got their phone numbers, we got their websites, we got their email addresses. That means that 1 out of 200 citizens, children, adults and pensioners, 1 out of 200 is a graphic designer. That's absolutely amazing. That was in 2009, and I'm not sure if that number has not decreased dramatically, and we need to repeat this study. But it would mean, and I know that scientists never should extrapolate, that in a city like Castelo Branco with 31,000 people, there are at least 150 graphic designers working at the moment. And in a city like Lisbon with 2.9 million people, there are 14,000 graphic designers. 14,000 graphic designers in Lisbon. And that means that the society needs that many graphic designers just to keep the society going. That's just the area. These are competitors, colleagues, depends how you see it. But these are graphic designers who actually do commercial work. But the numbers do not really mean very much. They're not very interesting. They're interesting for things like this to show that there is a future outside the capital. You can stay in Castelo Branco and really work well as a graphic designer in this city, as in any other city in Portugal. But what gets more interesting is, with this list of graphic designers, these 700 people we found, we called them and said, can we make an appointment with you? Can we just interview you? And can we ask you 4 questions? First place, what are you doing? What are the activities you do when you start working? And how do you work? Do you use computers? Of course. What kind of software do you use? How do you integrate software with? Tell us. What are your results? How do you know that it's any good? How do you know that when to stop working? How do you know that it's time to go to the client and present? And how do you assess your results? What criteria do you use to figure out how good your design is? And fortunately, graphic designers love to talk about their work. And most of the interviews took 1.5 hours, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours. So we spent a lot of time interviewing graphic designers. And what happened was we did about 150 of these interviews. So we got a huge number of data to answer these 4 questions. And I'll show you some of the results. When graphic designers talk about their work, they mention these activities. I've put them in alphabetical order here because there's no structure. These are the things that graphic designers mentioned, translated into English, of activities they actually do. And one of the problems that came out, of course, is that if you have an activity like image editing, that can mean, for some designers, to save a JPEG file as a PNG file, so basically changing the digital format. But it can also mean a lady who did the Otto catalog in Germany, who had to deal with about 12,000 photographs and made sure that all the colors in all those photographs were matching. That's also image editing, but that took her a full year's work. So it's really difficult to find out what the graphic designers actually mean with these activities. But we kept asking and we kept interviewing, and we found out that there are several patterns. And now it gets very interesting. All graphic designers work with visual elements. And there's 4 types of visual elements. You've got text, the typography, you've got images, the photography, the illustrations. You've got schematic elements, for example, the colors and the shapes and the patterns. And you've got inseparable elements. And inseparable elements are things like maps and diagrams and logos and symbols that you cannot separate the text, the color, the schematic elements and the images from each other. You have to use it as one unit. And of course, this can be on screen, it can be on paper, it can be 3-dimensional, it can be on buildings, it can be signage, but they always work with these 4 elements. And when graphic designers talk about these elements and about specialisms with these elements, it's things like this. It's type design, typography, when you talk about text, imagery, illustration and photography. Schematic elements, it's got color corrections and things like that. Inseparable elements, animation, logo design and infographics. And it's these activities that are related to the visual elements. And I have got a very practical example with me. It's an ordinary box for ibuprofen, medicine box. I'm very familiar with medicine boxes. I usually design them for larger companies. But you can see here very clearly the textual elements in the text, the illustrations elements in the colors here, the patterns in the background, the schematic elements, and the inseparable element is the Boots Pharmaceuticals, which is their logo. As a graphic designer, you cannot change that logo without getting into major discussions with Boots. So we have the 4 elements here. And graphic designers can change the outside of this box, the design of this box, within seconds. They can change the illustration, they can change the colors, they can change the design, they can change the type. And that can go on forever and forever and forever, because there's no way of stopping that. You can make changes, visual changes for a very long time. But the reason to do that refers to the second group of activities. Graphic designers always, all of them, link the characteristics of the client with the characteristics of the readers, the patients in this case, through the characteristics of the contents. So you have a bit of information, you have to make sure that it fits into the structure of the client, that represents the client correctly. It has to be understood by the readers, and it has to contain the information that is actually in the information itself. And if we're talking about these kinds of specialisms, if you talk about the design for the characteristics of the commissioner, you talk about identity design and advertising. If you focus more on the characteristics of the contents, you talk about editorial design and data visualization. And if you talk about the characteristics of the beholder, you talk more about instructional design and information design. And again, I'll show you the medicine box to show these 3 things. The client, of course, here is Boots. The contents of the information, the content characteristics, are all legally obligatory in Europe. So you must mention the name of the active ingredients as ibuprofen. You must mention the pharmaceutical form. You must mention how many is in there. And the rest is just how to make sure that people can understand it. And to make sure that patients can understand it, it lasts up to 12 hours. It relieves pain. It tells you what to do. It tells you what it does. And it's easy to swallow. These are the patient characteristics added to this particular box. And it's clear that Boots really tries to communicate a bit of information on the outside of the box to a particular type of people with probably headaches and inflammation. That's not the last one. The last one is the visual dialogue. And that is the longer term relation between the commissioner, the client, and the beholder, the user, the patient, the student. And in English language, we don't have one word for a user. User is a drug addict. It is not the right word. Beholder is an ancient word. It is old-fashioned, it's too traditional, it's conservative. Patient, in my case, will be appropriate. A student will be appropriate. Citizen might be appropriate. It depends who you design for. But beholder is somebody who reads actively. Audience is a passive way of looking at it. But there's no word in English language that actually covers this. But that's what graphic designers do. They make sure that the commissioner, the client, and their audience, their patients, their citizens, are in longer term conversation. It's not only about a single box, which you read once. It is, if you buy ibuprofen again in 5 years' time, you remember the design of this box, and you buy probably the same brand. That's a longer term activity, longer term dialogue. And if you look at what graphic designers actually talk about then, they talk about identity management, content management, communication strategies, user research, and these are all longer term activities that do not relate to one single graphic design bit, but they relate to a longer term dialogue between the commissioner and their contacts. So for the last time I look at this particular box, this medicine box, and it's clear that it's purely designed to provide information while you're buying it in a pharmacy, and it is designed in a way that you can memorize this box forever. And you memorize the colors, and you memorize the house style of boots. It's purely designed for memory, to recognize this later on. And if you look at the whole picture then, it looks like something like this. So graphic designers always work with visual elements. Graphic designers always work on a visual strategy to relate the commissioner and the client, sorry, the client and the beholder. And they always work for a visual dialogue, for a longer term relation between the client and the beholders. But this was the first pattern that came out of graphic design interviews. We did the 150 interviews. We went back with this diagram to them, said, look, this has matched your experience. And lo and behold, people recognize this, which was very nice. And it's confirmed that this seems to be a way of talking about graphic design by graphic designers. This was the first pattern, because if you ask graphic designers, is this all you do? Monday morning at 9 o'clock you go into your office, you choose your elements, you set out a strategy, and you talk about a dialogue. And it turns out there's a complete second set of activities as well. And these activities are more familiar with, these are outside design, but these are all essential to do to make design possible. Graphic designers have to plan and manage projects. Of course, they've got to figure out how much money they can make. They have got to plan if they have the right amount of people. They have to figure out if they can meet the deadlines. They have to organize their work. Second activities are they have to present their work. You have to go out to your client and talk to the client about what you've done. You've got to present your work on television interviews. You've got to present your work in showcases. You've got to write about it. But you have to spend time on presenting your work. All graphic designers evaluate and test. And test in a way can be for a very informal talk to a few colleagues, that you show your work to a colleague and say, look, what do you think of it? It can also be all the way down to a usability test with a few hundred people, where you do an absolutely formal usability test to figure out if your design works. But all design is always tested, from a very informal to an extremely formal area. The last activity in this is the implementation. It's not only the design, when you have your design ready and you just send off the PDF to the printer, but you're also responsible, many designers take the responsibility that the implementation of the design inside a company actually is progressing through the company. You have to sometimes design a complete educational program, how to implement the new house style, how to develop new forms, how to make sure that people understand the new website, that they shouldn't program it themselves but use the templates. And these template designs need to be implemented, need to be sure that the whole company, the whole organization is aware that the design is set. The second group is the three activities which are usually grouped together as the analysis of the analysis of the project, the analysis of the problem. The first one is to consider the situation, and that's all the areas that you have to deal with but you cannot influence. In my area, when you design a box like this, you have to deal with 24 languages in Europe. I can't design a language, I can't change the number of languages spoken in Europe. I've got to deal with the European legislation, I can't change that. I've got to deal with ibuprofen. I can't change, I'm not a pharmacist, I can't change ibuprofen. So I've got to deal with 24 languages, European legislation, and the contents of the information. That's the situation. I can't deal with it, I can't change it, I've got to deal with it. Within that structure, within the languages, within the legislation, I can choose a problem. And the problem is people can't understand what's happening on the back. People can't understand how to take ibuprofen and don't understand how dangerous this stuff can be. And the perspective in my case is the patient perspective. I don't take the perspective of making profits. I don't make the perspective of the production lines to make it as cheap as possible to produce it. I don't take a sustainability point of view. I take the view from the take the perspective of the patient when they're sitting on the kitchen table and having to take this medicine. So the situation I can't do anything about. I have to deal with that. I've got to know about it. The problem is people can't understand the medicines. And the perspective is I take the patient perspective, nothing else. this morning in the British newspapers, 22,000 people die every year in the NHS. 22,000 people die every year in the NHS because of poor medicines information. That's 7 times as much as in traffic. It's the first report ever in the UK that comes out with that figure. In my research, I found, always said till now, 1 casualty per million per day. So Portugal's got 11 million people. 11 people die today because of poor medicines information. That's the situation I've got to deal with. And that's, if you ask graphic designers, I'm not going to do them a medical talk, I'm going to talk about graphic design, then that's what's happening. And one last thing that came out of these interviews, which was absolutely fascinating, is that graphic designers always consider their position. They decide if the project that they have to do, if it's suitable for their personality, if they would be happy to have that on their website, if they are happy to present that project on their, tell it to their family, their mothers and their family, and their colleagues. For example, yes, we like to do museum design for museums. No, we don't want to work for the cigarettes industry, smoking industry. No, we don't want to work for the oil industry. Maybe you don't want to work for the pharmaceutical industry, because you cannot put that on your website because you sign contracts that in the next 30 years you're not allowed to talk about any of it. So, but every time the graphic designers have the choice to say no to project. Sorry, I don't want to work for you because I don't want to work for you. Other professions, I can't say when I'm teaching, sorry, that part of the room, I'm not teaching today, I don't feel like it. If I'm a doctor and a patient comes in and needs my help, I can't say, sorry, it's Friday afternoon, go away. It's obligatory to help. A lawyer must help in cases. It's obligatory. A translator must translate. A designer can choose to say, sorry, not today. Find somebody else. And that's a unique situation. But for every project graphic designers do, they consider if the project can be very good for their own personality and for their website and for their presentations afterwards. And now it gets a bit fuzzy, because this is where the discussion stopped. All designers agreed that they do these activities, but we can group them, and this is where the discussion started to get a bit funny. The organization, the realization, the approach, the grouping of these activities is not very clear. But if you put it in a diagram, it looks like that. And it's too small to read. The top one is graphic design. That is the first diagram. There's this elements of strategy and dialogue. Organization, the analysis, the personal development, the presentation, the testing, and the implementation. And graphic designers go from one point to the other. Really talk, while they're designing, they move from one dot to the other very, very quickly. And they consider all 9 dots at the same time. Not all 9 dots are in every project as large as each other. So it is wrong to see that every dot is as important as each other. But every dot can be used as a starting point for any project. So this is what graphic designers have told me that they are doing. Their main activity is graphic design. They need 8 other activities to actually do that. So if you put both next to each other, you get this. Visual communication design is what graphic designers do, and this is a reflective practice, what they need to do to be able to design. Now it gets interesting, because I think that this is applicable to many, many professions. That if you are a nurse or a teacher or a musician or a fashion designer, interior designer, these are applicable to those professions as well. That's what Donald Schoen said in 1983 when he was talking about reflective practice. That's unique for graphic design, and that needs to change. If you do music, you don't work with textual elements. You don't have a visual strategy. But so if you talk about music, that diagram needs to change. This one stays probably the same. Okay, so let's go to the second part. I mean, try to figure out what's happening. Who decides if the quality of the design is good enough? Because you can do all these activities. You can be very good in designing or very poor in designing, very good in presenting, very poor in presenting. Who decides if it's actually good enough? And who can actually say that? Who is it, designers themselves? Who decides? And Jan gave yesterday a very good overview of it when he described the Y-shaped designer. But that's from a design point of view. I approach it not from a design or from an education point of view. I'm not talking about education, I'm talking about commercial practice. How do commercial practitioners, people who make money designing, how do they decide if their work is good enough? And again, I use a medical leaflet. That's the leaflet that comes to the in here. This is the bula. Who thinks that this is well designed? Who thinks it's okay? We've got two people who actually agree. Absolutely, it is. Somebody has decided at some point that it was worth printing this probably 60 million times. 60 million times printed this leaflet. It's a huge print job, and that's only the British leaflet because it has been translated in all other 24 languages in Europe. This is printed probably about 500 million times a year. That's a nice graphic design project. But it's not very well designed, is it? Typography is poor, it's hard to read, it is difficult to understand. I suggest that there are at least 6 different groups of people who can actually talk to us and decide how good this is. And I think the first group is the designer, the developer, the person who actually decided on the typeface, on the color, on the bit of paper. And I put 2 examples here because I was looking at the coffee break outside and I saw this sign. And somebody has designed that. Somebody has been standardizing that particular sign and made sure that when there's a fire here or a bomb alarm, that everybody goes to the same point outside this building and gathers around that sign. But somebody has been proud enough to design that. Somebody has had a task as a graphic designer to design that particular sign. But the designer can only, when you look back at it, decide on things like, was it a profitable project? Did I get enough money for it to design it? Was it a enjoyable cooperation? Did I like the client? Is he coming back to me for the next project? How does that, did I actually look at it? Is it a good visual solution? Do I put it on my website because I believe that it's absolutely excellent? And I would like to have more of these projects designing these leaflets. Because if you put them on your website and you've done it for 500 million patients, you get a lot more work because there's not many people who actually can design these leaflets. But the designer decides, yes, this is good enough. And they've got several criteria, but they are design criteria. The second group of people who look at this, exactly the same two things from a very different perspective is the client, the commissioner, the person who is actually paying for it. And they decide if it communicates with their contacts. So the top one, it's a good design if everybody gets out and it's easy to count people after a fire alarm, that everybody goes to the same place. Then that's a good sign. This is a good sign if it makes profit and not too many complaints and not many people complaining about it on their phone helplines or complaining about it on Facebook to say that it's illegible and incomprehensible. And it's things like, does it fit into a strategy? Does it increase the profits? Am I still ahead of the competition if it's a commercial project? Not so much the top one, but the bottom one. These are criteria by clients. The you, the singular you. The he, she part is the third group, and that's the regulations and the standards. Both of these things are heavily regulated. That's a legal obligation. European legal obligation and a Portuguese legal obligation. This one as well. There are people who check these standards. Every year, the fire people, every 2 years, the fire people will come in and check if that sign is still outside. Every time, every 5 years, this is read by the regulators in Europe. They worry in London, they go to the Amsterdam zone, and they check if this text is still correct. So, and these regulators check these design objects, is it correctly submitted? That means, have you submitted the photograph on time through the right channels to make sure that the regulators can actually check it? Is it evidence-based? Have you got any reasoning why you designed it and why you designed it like this? And does it follow the laws? Because somebody has to check if that's legal, and somebody's got to check if this is legal. And they've got criteria to design, so to assess these designs based upon legislation and based upon evidence. Okay, that's the third group. The fourth group is the professional we, is the we group. It's the professional discipline. If you are working as a graphic designer, there's a ton of organizations, the typographic associations, the graphic design associations, International Waarde, IIID, which is the International Institute for Information Design. And they give awards, they have websites, they want to promote the profession. And they've got questions like, is this best practice? Can we actually use this to convince other clients, other people, that designers do their work quite well? Does it push the boundaries? Is it really a novel approach, this? Is it new? Does it promote design in general? Does it help us to make sure that design is a valuable asset for a company? And could it win awards? There are sign awards. There are no awards for this stuff, fortunately. But could this win awards? Because every year you've got hundreds of design awards that designers submit their materials, and they believe that if you submit a box like this, it could win an award. Why not? But that's the professional peers, that's your colleagues deciding, judging the design based upon the professional criteria. That's the fourth group. The fifth group, and that's for me the most important one, is the patients, the health carers. And that only applies to this one, but the actual users of that are the people who work in this particular building. And it can be guests, it can be staff, it can be students, but all of them have to be able to follow that sign or find that sign. It's going to be quite complex because it's easy to see when you're outside. It's bloody hard to find when you're inside. But the people who actually have to follow these instructions have got questions like, is it effective? Can I actually find my way out of this building quickly enough to that particular point? Is it usable? Can I actually take my medicines correctly? Is it suitable? If I wake up in the middle of the night with a stomach ache, and after I've taken this medicine, can I find in here if a stomach ache is a side effect? And does it really help? Is this really the best way of providing information to patients or to people who live in this work in this building? That's the you, the plural you, the users. And they've got, these criteria are very, very useful for people who actually have to read and understand the information. And the last group, the they, is the society at large. And the society at large looks at issues of longer term survival, like sustainability, the cost of medicines. Every time, every week, every 2 weeks, there's a story in the newspaper that the society, the healthcare insurance and the tax office cannot pay for the most expensive medicines anymore. That's a society issue. The safety concerns with these issues, for example, there is an enormous amount of antibiotics disappearing into wastewater. People just throw away the antibiotics into the toilet. And that means that fish really get poisoned because of our waste of antibiotics. That's a society issue. And they decide if this paper, 560 million of these illegible leaflets, if that's acceptable or not. That's a society issue. Environmental issues and religious considerations. Religious considerations look like a funny thing, but these capsules are made from gelatin. And gelatin might have, not always, have an animal background. So for the Jewish community and for the Muslim communities, these capsules are not acceptable. Give me something else. That means in Europe you have got millions of people who do not take these tablets. So the religious concerns are part of the society concerns how to take these medicines. And they decide if it's clear or not and if they can use this information or not. So we have in total 6 different types of criteria to evaluate the graphic design of these 2 examples. And I'll put them here very crudely into one list. I, as a designer, I decided it's good based on my design principles, based on my design background. I'm a professor in this stuff. I must be able to evaluate how good I design. The client works on profit margins mainly. The regulators look at legal aspects. The professional peers look at the discipline. The patients and their proxies, or the users, or the beholders, look at health issues. And the society at large look at longer term survival. And the problem for designers is that none of these criteria overlaps. There's 6 different value systems on the screen at the moment, and you cannot make sure that they relate one to one. If I'm a patient and I'm ill, I don't care if it costs money or if it's a legal medicine, cure me. If I'm a pharmaceutical industry, I don't care if it's legal or if patients get better, as long as it sells. And if I'm a regulator, somebody who looks at the legal situation, I don't care if it cures patients or if the industry loses money, as long as it's legal, it's fine. And there's no way of making one design that satisfies all 6. And that means that as a designer, all the time for every project, you've got to evaluate all 6 different value systems and make sure that you find a balance. And if you say, I'm a designer, I've got a big ego, what I design is perfect, and shut up, because I don't accept any negotiation about that, I've decided that it's good, that's fine, because it's one particular viewpoint. If you say, I'm a legal designer, I've designed legislation, then let's make sure that you stick to that. But you always have to balance all 6, which is an interesting result from the results. Going to the third part of the presentation, arguments and research. And the previous part, we saw that there were 6 different groups that we need to take into account when we design anything. But it's difficult to satisfy all of them. And how do we do that? And there's a long-term way of looking at it. And I think argumentation theory is one approach to do that. An argument is not intended here as a fight, as a real heated discussion where you shout at each other, and it's not that kind of argument I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a considered approach, a considered way of thinking, a considered way of talking to make sure that you can actually convince somebody else to understand your standpoint. And argumentation theory has got a very long history in design studies, and every design, I think, is a form of an argument, because every time you put something on the table as a design, you state that the previous design, the existing situation, is not as good as what your design is. So you always comment on the current situation. You always state that the current situation is not as good as your design. And you make a claim doing that. And that's a pure argument. You make a claim that this leaflet is better than what they had before. Somebody has made that claim, and somebody has convinced the pharmaceutical industry and the regulators that that's the case. So let's have a look at how these arguments are built up. And it's a long philosophical discussion, starting from Aristotle to the current day. But in the 1960s, 1958, Stefan Toulmin developed this diagram. And I think this is absolutely applicable to graphic design. It was published in The Uses of Arguments. It was a very small book, which is fantastic to read because it is blatantly simple. It really is a very easy flowing book, and it's a pleasure to read. But he suggested, Stephen Toulmin, that if you want to make a claim on the right hand side here, if you want to claim that this box is better than the previous one, you better make sure that you have the other parts in your arguments as well. You must make sure that you have a qualifier. And the qualifier is, it's only applicable for medicine boxes. It's only applicable for British patients. It's only applicable for a small group of patients with a headache. So you reduce the size of your claim by stating what the limits are. It's only applicable. If you cannot read English, this is useful. This is useless. So the qualifier makes sure that he distinguishes between this design is good in this area, but it will not work here. The left-hand side, you have to have the facts and the reasons right. So you have to make sure that you understand, that the designers understand, that you're talking to 560 million patients if you design this box, which is an unheard of number. You cannot interview them, all of them. You cannot interview You don't know who you're designing for. But those are the facts. That's the evidence you have to present. So how do you make sure that you understand these 560 million people? And now it gets interesting, because you have the warrant, and I think I'll go one slide further to skip some time. So the claim with all this stuff is well-designed information enables patients to take medicines and to make health decisions. Because at the moment, it's questionable. 22,000 people die in England, so I don't think it's an argument anymore. And my evidence is people struggle to understand the information of medicines. That's the facts. You can measure that. And the claim is you have to provide the information in a specific context. The warrant is people get ill. We still can't do anything about that. And medicines, the backing of that is medicines have a positive effect on patients. So what I'm doing here, I'm building up a very careful argument how to make sure that this claim for this box is actually useful. So if you have a headache, if you have a headache, medicine will work. People at the moment have got problems understanding it. People have got problems in England for ibuprofen specifically. So we have to redesign it. And now the most important thing for designers is that the rebuttal that Stephen Toulmin mentioned already in 1958, that is the group of people who say you can't change your design. What you design is awful, it's too expensive, you can't use that. Patients will die if you do that. And it's these things, the rebuttals, that you have to make sure that you understand, because those are the people you have to convince. Those are the people, if the society says we don't want to have capsules made out of glycerine and particular animal fat, then that's the rebuttal. You have to change your design. And it's these rebuttals that get really, really important in providing arguments to make sure that your design is usable. Like can be produced and can be used in reality. What are the influences of this on this? And I'll go back, I'm sorry, it's a bit poorly legible. But the claim is made by the designer, the I person. I make the claim as a designer. You, the client, the users, the beholders, are designing the qualifier. So the qualifier is determined by the people who actually use your design. And if you design for the elderly in Portugal, that's fine. If you design for professors in Australia, they decide what language you have to use. But all the time, the people who use your design make the qualifier. The rebuttals are given by the client. Now, it's too expensive what you want to do. Or by the he, she, the legal arguments, the standards. Well, we can't change this because this is legally acceptable. You don't want to change any of this because this is what's acceptable. That's what the law says. The warrant is given by the disciplines, the designers, the pharmacists, the doctors, all the different disciplines who can say, who keep the situation as it is at the moment, and society at large. They say, we want to have medicines. And for many situations, if you think about the discussion about the SSRIs, the depressing depressants, medicines taken by people who are severely depressed because they can't handle the work. Well, if we reduce the working week from 40 hours a week to 15, then the number of antidepressants will go down, guaranteed. So that's a society decision. If we reduce the taxes, the number of medicines will be reduced because people struggle and are worried. And these are society issues. And the last two, the backing and the facts and reasons, are influenced by the current situation. That you have to understand what's happening in those situations to make sure that your design is actually can be influenced by those. The funny thing is, of course, most graphic designers, when you talk about this, they see the image, they see the relevance of this to their work. They really have problems applying this because they are not researchers. They're not used to talk about arguments in this particular way. And the reason to do that, the reason that they have problems is that they haven't got the knowledge, haven't got the understanding, and haven't got the facts right to provide the whole picture. So if you talk to a designer, most of the time you get a claim, knowledge about design, and you get the arguments back, the design argument. And in many cases, the other arguments of the other 5 groups, the you, the they, he or she, the we, the you plural, and the they, are more important in that situation. And we have to provide arguments as designers to make sure that the other 5 groups are listening as well. And that means that if you want to design something in the healthcare context, you need to know very well which context you're designing for. And that means we have to leave our computers and go into the hospitals, go to talk to doctors, go to talk to nurses, go talk to patients, because or else you can't understand what the situation is. And then it turns out that not all patients are identical. Then it turns out that medicines used in hospital are very different from medicines used in war areas, in emergency situations. They're very different from medicines that are used for life-saving treatments, for HIV, for diabetes, for things like that, are very different from medicines for a simple headache. But the legislation says that they're all identical. So you need to be able to understand the healthcare context. You have to understand the disciplinary knowledge, you have to understand what pharmacists do, what doctors do, what designers do, how society works, and that these 2 things are based on research findings. So you have to be able to do the research, to find the evidence, and to make sure that you understand as a designer what the warrant is, what the backing is, what the qualifiers are. And that's why you need research. And that's why you need not research into a library, although that's frequently helpful, but research by going out and talking to people what real doctors, real nurses, real pharmacists, real patients actually experience. There's 2 more remarks about this. If you want to design, then it turns out that research is providing you with the background knowledge to build a single argument, but testing, which means that you go out and I ask real people, can you please find out if you get a stomachache after taking this tablet? Do usability study, only provide information about the qualifier. And that clearly distinguishes what research is and what usability testing is. And in design, at the conference in Limerick in a few weeks' time, a few months' time, about the Design Research Society, this discussion is continuously confused because people say, no, I do research, I do usability testing. Toolman in 1958 already said that's different. You have to have usability testing for the qualifier and research to get the facts right. The major problem in this area is what designers are not very good at is to provide arguments for the rebuttal. We cannot provide financial arguments for our designs. We cannot provide legal arguments for our designs because we hate standards. We really dislike the financial spreadsheets to calculate the funding and the amount of money spent on these boxes and leaflets and information and these signs. We don't like to touch that. It's not part of our education. Please prove me wrong. Please tell me that there's a complete course here about the economical aspects of design. Worldwide, there's not a single course, which is insane. And this, of course, this diagram makes very clear, if I can get it right, why we need research in design. We need research to find that, and find that. That's why we need research. We need research, we need testing to make sure that we can actually prove that our design is okay. And then we finally can make the claim, we know how to design stuff, and we know how to make sure that people can understand what we're doing. Which brings me to the 4th part. I hope I'm a little bit on time. I draw a few conclusions. If you want to develop, the first one is based on the interviews with 150 graphic designers. That leads to 2 diagrams. On the left-hand side, what graphic designers do. On the right-hand side, what professionals do, what professional practice is about. And all designers work on the logic, the visual rhetoric, and the visual dialectics. That's part of visual communication design, graphic design. It's a very confusing terminology in general, but that's what graphic designers are doing. The second conclusion, is that there are at least 6 perspectives that evaluate and can assess the quality of your designs. It's not the design perspective only, but you have 6 different perspectives with 6 completely different value systems. And the problem for designers is that these value systems don't overlap. They don't have a single core, and you have to address all 6 of them. The third conclusion is that every design makes a claim in a context. Every design states that what you have designed is better than what has been there before. Therefore, you immediately critique the current situation, and you have to deal with that. Research provides the evidence for the backing and for the evidence, for the facts and the reasons, and test contextual performance. That really, if you want to design something and you want to use the argumentation theory to convince clients, convince regulators, convince audiences, convince society at large, then these 2 are research, that's testing, that's you interviewing. And if you have that clear, then it's very easy to convince other people, because this diagram is applicable to nearly all our human discussions. So, last few points. Make sure your visual arguments really performs. The elements, the strategy and the dialogue. You have to prove as a graphic designer that your statement, the things you design, really performs in a situation. And that is very, very difficult. Second point is that you have to make sure who you need to convince. Are you talking to regulators? Are you talking to clients? Are you talking to society? Are you talking to users? Are you talking to the disciplinary, your peers, your colleagues? If you don't understand these 6 different criteria and 6 different value systems, you use the wrong arguments for the wrong group of people. That means you use design arguments to convince a client who is only interested in profits. You use design arguments to convince a regulator who is only interested in legislation. And that fails. And as last point, make sure your claims are well supported. You have to find the qualifications, you have to indicate always, this is where my design works, and this is where it's not working. It's likely that if you design in Portuguese, if you go 100 kilometers eastwards and you have to talk to Spanish people, they can't understand. If you go 500 kilometers from here and you end up in France, the chance that they read Portuguese is nil. You have to make sure that your claims are well supported and that they are qualified according to language, according to age, according to your qualification system, that actually makes sure that your design only works in a particular area. And good design is not only about design. That's absolutely, design is only part of the design, graphic design. The strength of the argument depends on how well we can support the claim. So it's not about the design on its own. You have to develop the argument to convince everybody, all 6 groups, that your design is worth considering. And that means that we really have to accurately qualify our designs. We have to say exactly that's where it works, that's where it doesn't work. And we have to make absolutely sure that we have our facts right. And that is an absolutely fundamental critique of graphic design at the moment. Graphic designers in general don't have the facts right. If they talk to doctors, to regulators, to industry, to educators, they don't have the right facts. They don't have the backing to make sure that they have the data to convince other people. And that's a very big problem in graphic design at the moment. Thank you very much.